we get to the heart of the Russia-Ukraine war, we need to rewind through a shared history that's been filled with both cooperation and conflict over the last 1,000 years. This war can be seen as a ripple effect of the Soviet Union's breakup, much like other post-Soviet struggles we've seen. The roots of today's situation were planted even before Ukraine gained its independence, with Putin's mentor, Sobchak, predicting that a border war between Russia and Ukraine was almost inevitable. And then, everything came to a head with Gorbachev stepping down from the Soviet presidency on December 25, 1991, in a moment broadcasted across the world. Today, we're diving into how Russia and Ukraine's roles in the Soviet collapse set the stage for the conflict we see now. George H.W. Bush first met Gorbachev in March 1985 at the funeral of Soviet leader Chernenko. The 1980s saw frequent changes in Soviet leadership. Brezhnev died in November 1982. His successor Andropov served for just over a year before succumbing to illness, and Chernenko passed away in March 1985. During those years, Bush, representing the United States, often attended the funerals of Soviet leaders, making frequent trips to Moscow. In the U.S., Bush was known for the phrase, "You die, I fly." Gorbachev, who succeeded Chernenko, was only 54 and full of vigor. On July 30, 1991, now President of the United States, Bush flew to Moscow not for a funeral, but for a U.S.-Soviet summit. Since taking office, Gorbachev had introduced policies of openness and new thinking, which were well received by Western politicians. After the Berlin Wall fell, Gorbachev introduced the Sinatra Doctrine, humorously named after Frank Sinatra's song My Way. This allowed Warsaw Pact member states to exit the Soviet sphere of influence. Bush's visit aimed to finalize an agreement to reduce 50% of Soviet intercontinental missiles, most of which targeted the U.S. At the summit, Bush praised Gorbachev for the significant progress under his leadership. In the U.S., everyone knew at least two Russian words, openness and new thinking, while in Russia, everyone appreciated one English word, democracy. Despite Bush's compliments, Gorbachev smiled outwardly but thought, "I've reduced weapons and implemented democracy, so why is it always so hard to get economic aid from you Americans?" As the two leaders exchanged pleasantries, time passed quickly, and soon it was time for the banquet. The night before the summit, Yeltsin called Gorbachev, asking if he could join him and Bush at the banquet. Gorbachev thought, "This old guy just wants to steal my spotlight," and firmly refused. Unexpectedly, at dinner the next day, Yeltsin, fueled by vodka, approached Mrs. Bush and enthusiastically asked, "My esteemed lady, may I have the honor of leading you in a dance?" Mrs. Bush was taken aback and asked, "Is that allowed?" The surrounding journalists were equally bewildered and at a loss. He deliberately turned his attention to the other side, discussing the exquisite chandelier hanging above them with Gorbachev. "If that chandelier were to come crashing down, I might not be here." To give you some context, Yeltsin's rude behavior and his attempt to embarrass Gorbachev stemmed from their long-standing animosity. Understanding the complex interplay between various factors is crucial, even if it's not directly related to today's topic. Gorbachev's Sinatra Doctrine not only encouraged the Warsaw Pact countries to confidently pursue their own paths but also inspired the Soviet Union's member republics to seek autonomy. As the leader of Russia, the largest Soviet republic, Yeltsin felt envious watching Gorbachev and Bush toasting each other, fueling his ambitions to replace Gorbachev. The dinner menu featured sesame watercress soup, truffle roast beef, baked potatoes, red wine, and sparkling champagne. Bush, always the eloquent speaker, continued to praise Gorbachev during his dinner speech, noting that Gorbachev's reforms had brought hope not only to the Soviet people but also to Americans. After a few rounds of drinks, Yeltsin stood up, walked over to Bush's table, pounded his chest, and loudly assured Bush that he, Yeltsin, would do everything within his power to support the reforms. Bush glanced at Gorbachev, then at Yeltsin, his mind racing, and he smiled. That night in Moscow, Bush left with many thoughts. The next morning, on August 1, 1991, after bidding farewell to Gorbachev, President George H.W. Bush boarded Air Force One and flew to Kiev. Leonid Kravchuk, the 57-year-old chairman of the Ukrainian parliament, warmly welcomed him. Kravchuk, with his energetic demeanor and graying hair, resembled John Gotti, the infamous boss of the Gambino crime family. At that time, the U.S. military had 40 nuclear warheads aimed at Kiev, which would be reduced to rubble in the event of a nuclear war. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin disapproved of Bush's visit to Kiev. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin believed that the second-largest republic in the Soviet Union shouldn't be allowed to go its own way. During talks at the Kremlin, Yeltsin made his stance clear: Ukraine must not leave the Soviet Union. According to a 1991 poll by U.S. intelligence agencies, only 22% of Russians supported Ukrainian independence, while 60% opposed it. Since the 1950s, Ukrainian elites had governed their own republic and played significant roles in the administration of the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev, who once held power in Moscow, had long served as the first Secretary of Ukraine. His successor, Brezhnev, was a Russian from Ukraine, and his party membership card from the 1930s listed his place of origin as Ukraine. Although Gorbachev was half Ukrainian, he had no ties to the Ukrainian political establishment. His mentor was his predecessor, Andropov, and when Gorbachev took office, he cut off the path for Ukrainian officials to ascend to Moscow. As a result, the Ukrainian party elites felt betrayed and began to entertain thoughts of separation. Kravchuk, once a young boy who had waited patiently for decades, was now meticulously planning for the right moment. Bush arrived to a thunderous welcome as soon as he stepped off the plane. Banners held by the welcoming crowd read, "Mr. Bush, Ukraine welcomes you." The band played the Soviet, American, and Ukrainian national anthems. How much loyalty did Ukraine still have for the Soviet Union at this point? This detail provides a clue. When Nixon visited Ukraine in 1972, his speech was translated into Russian. This time, Bush's speech was translated into Ukrainian. Bush's motorcade traveled from the airport to the center of Kiev, where thousands of people gathered in the square, waving blue and yellow flags symbolizing the Ukrainian independence movement. Facing the massive crowd, Bush silently told himself to stay calm. He had his aides remove the definite article from Ukraine in his speech, then handed the revised speech to Kravchuk for review. Kravchuk was pleasantly surprised. From Brezhnev to Gorbachev, he was used to being ordered around. Bush's gesture made him feel a sense of mutual understanding. Kravchuk wanted to achieve two things with Bush's visit: establish a Ukrainian consulate in the United States and sign a $5 billion investment agreement. In front of the imposing Lenin statue, Bush began his speech by delving into the etymology of Ukraine and emphasized the themes of freedom and responsibility. Throughout his address, Bush meticulously avoided linking Ukraine's history and geography with Russia, a significant departure from Nixon's 1972 visit when Nixon referred to Ukraine as Soviet land. After an engaging introduction, Bush shifted his tone to clarify that freedom and independence are not synonymous. He emphasized that Americans do not support suicidal nationalism rooted in ethnic hatred and that the U.S. does not endorse Ukraine's bid for independence, although those who wish to seek independence are free to do so. Bush's approach was akin to a delicate dance, enticing Ukraine with one hand while maintaining a serious demeanor with the other, leaving pro-independence Ukrainians both excited and frustrated. 3 days after Bush's visit to Kiev, a group of Ukrainian protesters marched to the White House, chanting, "Mr. Bush, Ukraine wants independence." The message was clear and had been received. After the meeting, Yeltsin walked out of the White House and headed towards the reporters waiting on the lawn. He recounted the details of the encounter to the world. Although Yeltsin had achieved his goal of meeting the U.S. president, he couldn't shake off the feeling of jealousy over Bush's support for Gorbachev. 2 years later, in August, shortly after Bush's visit to Moscow and Kiev, Yeltsin was vacationing at a villa near Moscow. Just after 6 a.m., his daughter burst in with shocking news: Gorbachev has been arrested. Back on the night of the summit banquet, KGB chief Kryukov was already simmering with frustration. Kryukov, 67, with graying hair and a balding head, had been in charge of the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Agency for 14 years and was known for his meticulousness. Initially, Kryukov supported Gorbachev's reforms, believing they would make the Soviet Union more competitive. However, as the reforms progressed, Kryukov and a group of senior military officials grew increasingly uneasy, realizing that Gorbachev's changes threatened the survival of the Communist Party. On July 29, 1991, the day before Bush's visit to Moscow, Gorbachev had a late-night discussion with a few close aides at his villa. Following the signing of the new Union Treaty, they discussed potential personnel changes, including the replacement of Kryukov. Unbeknownst to them, the adept KGB chief had wiretapped the meeting. Upon learning of his imminent dismissal, Kryukov decided to take drastic action. He orchestrated a coup and placed Gorbachev under house arrest at the Foros Dacha on the Crimean Peninsula, a popular Soviet retreat. On the morning of August 19, at 6 a.m., Soviet media announced that Gorbachev had been removed from office, reforms were over, and the country was under a state of emergency with a newly formed emergency committee. That evening, Bush recorded a heartfelt message for Gorbachev. "Mikhail Gorbachev, as I sit here listening to the intelligence reports, I can't be sure if you'll have the chance to return. I hope you don't make too many compromises, otherwise, even if you come back, it will be a tough road ahead." At this critical moment, Yeltsin set aside his jealousy for the greater good. Taking a swig of vodka, he grabbed his prepared appeal to the citizens of Russia and dashed out of the heavily guarded parliament building. Emboldened by the alcohol, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank in front of a large crowd, loudly declaring the coup illegal. More and more people gathered around, eagerly listening. With impassioned fervor, Yeltsin, risking sniper fire, continued to speak, igniting the crowd's enthusiasm. General Lebed privately advised Yeltsin that if he wanted the military support, he must declare himself the commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces. Yeltsin heeded the advice, and the tide began to turn. On the afternoon of August 21, Gorbachev was reinstated. When Bush called and heard Gorbachev's shaken voice, he couldn't help but exclaim, "Oh, God, thank goodness, Mikhail." This episode greatly enhanced Yeltsin's prestige. He rallied the masses in Moscow, declared the tricolor flag of red, blue, and white as the Russian national flag, and vowed to achieve complete independence for Russia. Yeltsin rescued Gorbachev from the coup plotters, only to make him a different kind of prisoner. Yeltsin marched into Gorbachev's office like a stern mentor and demanded the dismissal of several ministers, calling them coup plotters. Gorbachev tried to stall, saying, "I'll consider it." Yeltsin refused to leave, firmly stating, "No, I won't step out of here until you handle this right in front of me." Following Yeltsin's orders, Gorbachev issued the dismissals. Yeltsin then escalated the situation by recommending Air Force Marshal Shaposhnikov as the new defense minister, and Gorbachev agreed. During this time, Yeltsin took control of what remained of the Soviet government, including the Moscow Kremlin. After achieving this, Yeltsin, in high spirits, patted Gorbachev on the shoulder and enthusiastically suggested, "You've had a tough time lately. How about we throw a big party, invite your wife, my wife, and a few good friends?" On the evening of August 23, George H.W. Bush watched the televised meeting between Gorbachev and the Russian representatives. Meanwhile, in Vinnytsia, a city in central Ukraine, Kravchuk was inspecting a department store. The head of security informed him that thousands of people had gathered outside to see him, and the local police lacked enough manpower to maintain order. When they suggested that Kravchuk use the back door, he scoffed, "Ridiculous. Do you expect me to sneak away from the crowd like a thief? They're about to vote for me." Ignoring the security personnel's advice, Kravchuk stepped forward and began addressing the surging crowd. The people chanted, "Long live Kravchuk." Smiling, Kravchuk acknowledged their cheers. However, the crowd was out of control. Those at the back pushed those at the front, all eager to catch a glimpse of him. Suddenly, Kravchuk felt a sharp pain. Someone in the crowd, overly enthusiastic to shake his hand, had accidentally broken his finger. Despite the injury, Kravchuk was moved by the crowd's enthusiasm, further solidifying his belief that the Ukrainian referendum would succeed. The final result of the referendum showed that more than 92% of people supported independence. In Odessa Oblast, over 85% voted in favor. In the Donbass region, Luhansk Oblast had over 83% support, and Donetsk Oblast nearly 77%. Crimea had a support rate of 54%. Gorbachev's position had become increasingly embattled, and this outcome left him stunned. On December 1, 1991, Ukrainians dealt the final blow to the Soviet Union by voting overwhelmingly for independence. He couldn't grasp how sentiment had shifted so dramatically in just a few months. It all seemed so sudden. On December 3, 1991, President George H.W. Bush had his assistant connect a call to Kravchuk, congratulating him on winning the Ukrainian presidential election and achieving overwhelming support for Ukraine's independence. Bush told Kravchuk that the American people welcomed the birth of this new democratic nation and would send a delegation to discuss nuclear disarmament, borders, and human rights issues. Yeltsin responded noncommittally, as he had his own plans. In 1957, in the Belovezh forest, inside a hunting lodge, Khrushchev was cleaning his rifle. Known for his marksmanship, Khrushchev enjoyed hunting European bison and drinking bison grass vodka. The Belovezh forest, located near Minsk, the capital of Belarus, had become a national reserve during his rule. Seasons changed, and time flew by. Decades later, three powerful men, Yeltsin, President of Russia, Kravchuk, President of Ukraine, and Shushkevich, President of Belarus, would hunt and drink in this forest while plotting a world-shaking event. On the night of December 7, 1991, inside a hunting lodge in Belovezh, the three leaders sat down. The firelight flickered, illuminating a historic moment filled with fine wine, delicacies, and an air of conspiracy. Yeltsin and Kravchuk faced each other across the table like two titans, while others, including the president of Belarus, watched history unfold. As the banquet began, Yeltsin, following protocol, placed the draft Union Treaty, which Gorbachev and others had discussed weeks earlier, on the table. He asked Kravchuk to sign it on behalf of the Soviet president, adding, "I'll sign it too." Kravchuk smiled and presented a stack of documents, revealing the results of the Ukrainian referendum. Yeltsin was taken aback. Even Donbass voted in favor? Kravchuk nodded. Yes, every region had more than half the votes in favor. With these facts, Kravchuk stood firm in his decision not to join any union, resolute in his pursuit of independence. Seeing this, Yeltsin shifted his approach, blending persuasion with pressure. Yeltsin spoke of the shared history between Russia and Ukraine and subtly warned that if Ukraine left the Soviet Union, the agreements on the Russia-Ukraine border would become void, leading to territorial divisions. "What you took from me, give it back." Negotiations reached a deadlock. After a while, Kravchuk tried a different approach. He asked Yeltsin, "When you return to Russia, what will your position be?" "I am the president elected by the Ukrainian people." "What will your role be?" "Gorbachev's subordinate?" Yeltsin, taken aback by the question, fell silent. Kravchuk knew he had struck a nerve. Dostoevsky once said, "When God and the devil fight, the battleground is the human heart." In that moment, the devil won. Yeltsin's demeanor and tone shifted as he ambiguously suggested, "If there's no Ukraine, then Russia won't sign either. Perhaps we can explore a new structure to replace the Soviet Union." Kravchuk and Yeltsin exchanged knowing glances, reaching a mutual understanding. Seeing the two senior leaders in agreement, Belarusian President Shushkevich quickly chimed in, "Count me in." With the major decision made, the Belarusian host invited the Russian and Ukrainian delegates to relax in a sauna and have a few more drinks. Yeltsin's eyes lit up. "If we're doing this, I won't be tired at all." Amidst the drinking and revelry, a tipsy Yeltsin banged on the table and declared, "Gorbachev must step down. I've had enough. I won't play along with this Tsar anymore." Early the next morning, Russian and Belarusian experts handed over the agreement they had drafted overnight to the well-rested Ukrainian representatives, who approved the document. From left to right, Kravchuk, Shushkevich, Yeltsin. After breakfast, the three leaders of Belovezhskaya Pushcha toasted with Soviet champagne and moved to a billiard room that had been converted into a conference hall. They were about to make a historic decision on the world stage, akin to sinking the ball in a crucial shot. Thus, the declaration ending the Soviet Union was crafted. It began with, "We, the Republic of Belarus, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine, as the founding states of the Soviet Union that signed the 1922 treaty, hereby declare that the Soviet Union no longer exists." A page of history turned, changing the course of time. On Christmas Day in 1991, as dusk settled and night fell, tourists in Red Square and the honor guards marching towards Lenin's mausoleum witnessed a stunning sight. The Soviet Union's red flag was slowly lowered. After watching CNN's broadcast of Gorbachev's resignation, George H.W. Bush, dressed in a suit, stepped into a television studio to provide a detailed explanation of this historic moment. Bush linked the collapse of the Soviet Union with the end of the Cold War, celebrating the triumph of American values in this struggle. In 3 sentences, he used the word victory 3 times. Bush excitedly stated that the world, once divided into 2 opposing military camps, now had only one unparalleled superpower left, the United States of America. Such an outcome didn't come overnight. In its efforts to bring down the Soviet Union, the United States had been relentless. In 1945, Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, delivered a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, detailing methods to undermine the Soviet Union. He stated, "The war will end, everything will be reshaped. We will use all our resources, gold, and material strength to shape people into what we need, making them listen to us. People's minds and consciousness can change. If we can confuse their minds, we can subtly change their values and make them believe in a distorted set of values. How will we do this? We must find people within Russia who agree with our ideology and make them our allies. We will support and elevate a group of so-called artists, who will instill in people's minds the worship of sex, violence, cruelty, and betrayal, essentially, the worship of all immoral values. In managing the state, we will create chaos and confusion. We will skillfully sanctify all these, making them bloom like beautiful flowers. Only a few will perceive or recognize this, but we will isolate them, making them objects of ridicule. We will find ways to defame them, declaring them to be the dregs of society. We will uproot Bolshevism and vulgarize and eliminate its spiritual and moral foundations. We must achieve this. In 1999, Yeltsin handed over power to Putin, advising him, "Take good care of Russia." That same year, a freshman named Zelensky at Kiev National Economic University formed a comedy troupe called Kvartal 95 with his friends and went to Russia to participate in a talent show. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps us going. Thank you.